Welcome to the Anime Audiophile Podcast. Please like and subscribe for more. Thank you. Shikamaru Hiden, a cloud drifting in the silent dark. Shikamaru Chapter 3. Shikamaru raised ever higher as though lured upward by the long, twisting staircase, eyes focused on Django's back ahead of him. His aides were fighting in the hall, while this man, revered like a god, fled by himself. Closed in by stone walls, the spiral staircase felt strangely oppressive. The twisting path was almost dizzying. "How about you be good and give up already?" Shikamaru called, with no expectation of an answer. Up ahead, an enormous iron door, an ill-formed and unrefined gate totally without adornment, appeared. Django didn't hesitate. He pushed the heavy door back and disappeared inside. Shikamaru caught a glimpse of darkness through the crack before the door shut behind the other man. He put a hand on the closed door. He was certain it had to be some kind of trap. He knew he was being lured in somehow. He opened the door anyway. It didn't matter what scheme Django had hatched. He could only go forward. The space on the other side of the door was pitch black. An aura lay hidden in the silent darkness. One person. Abruptly, the door behind him slammed shut. The aura was in front of him, so either there was someone else or that had been a little trick of the owner of the aura before him. "So you've come alone, fearing nothing, HM? I can only pray your action does not prove foolhardy." Django's voice. "You have no hope of finding me in this darkness. For generations, the shinobi of the Nara house have manipulated our own shadows. And what gives birth to shadows is darkness. In a sense, darkness is the mother of the shadow. For me, living with shadows, this darkness is like the inside of my mother's womb. I've been able to see this whole time." This was half bluff. He was indeed accustomed to the darkness, but that didn't mean he could actually see in the dark. He was simply a little more sensitive to the strength of auras than other ninja. "Interesting. You truly are an interesting man. It's almost a shame to kill you here," Django said, in a tone brimming with self-satisfaction. Silence. Shikamaru and Django alike held their tongues, narrowing their awareness to focus on their opponent's aura. "I was originally a ninja of Kirigakure," Django began, speaking as if intentionally breaking the silence. "Do you know of a man named Momochi Zabuza?" He did. Naruto kept mentioning the name around the time he had just become a Chunin. Shikamaru was pretty sure Momochi Zabuza was a masterful rogue ninja who got stuck fighting on a mission he shouldn't have accepted. When Zabuza attempted a coup d'etat in Kirigakure, what he was aiming for was my ideal world. Django's ideal world, that ninja themselves would rule the world. However, the plot was exposed through the reports of collaborators, and Zabuza became a rogue ninja. My youthful self numbered among his followers at that time. But Zabuza needed money to realize his ideal, and thus joined forces with wealthy merchants, basically the mafia, and accepted dirty work. Many of our brethren turned their backs on Zabuza and went their separate ways when he dirtied his own hands in the name of his just cause. I was one of them. It's been a dozen or so years since then, and I finally obtained a country. It begins now." Django's voice was shaking. "My ambition finally begins now. And yet, because of you lot." Bloodlust began to bleed into Django's aura. The quiet sound of kicking at the earth reached Shikamaru's ears. He drew his kunai and readied himself. He couldn't see anything. All he could do was follow the aura. Django was headed straight for him. He was getting far too little information from directly in front of him. Zabuza mistook the path. He hurried to realize his ideal and dirtied his hands. "But I'm not like him. After a long road of hardship, I came up with this jutsu, swallowed people into a vortex of passion, and now rule this land. And I'll expand this vortex until it consumes the entire continent." Shikamaru heard something unusual in the shouting voice. The sound of the air being sliced. A blade. And a fairly large one. A hatchet? No, thinner. something like a halberd or a longsword. The aura pressed in on him. The rush of air was closing in on his own neck. He held his breath and flew to the side. His body was almost at a diagonal when he felt the blade racing above him. Nicely dodged. But don't think that this is the end, came a shout, following by the side-sweeping wind changing trajectories in the empty space between them. Shikamaru tumbled forward and propped himself up on one knee as the howling pressed in toward the crown of his head. In the darkness, he dreamed of Jingo. From the range of the slicing sound, he figured out the length of the blade and got an idea of the hilt attached to it. Beyond that was Jingo. In this darkness, he couldn't generate a shadow. He couldn't use ninjutsu to capture his enemy. He only had his own body to rely on. Shikamaru transformed into shadow. Such impudence. Jingo sneered hatefully. "I'm ready," Ino shouted at the same time. "Good." Shikamaru's preparations were also finished. His real body was sufficiently far from the reach of Jingo's blade, waiting for Ino to activate her mind transmission jutsu. Ino, in her signature position, the palms of both hands thrust out, a triangle created with her thumbs and index fingers, stared at Jingo. Ninja art. Mind transmission jutsu. Jingo immediately turned on his heel and ran from her, and Ino smiled quietly. The palms that had been targeting Jingo turned to Shikamaru. His entire body went rigid. He knew Ino was coming into his mind. The jutsu was only activated for a brief instant. In the time it took for their breath to nearly become one, he was already free of it. "Soku. Row!" Ino called, releasing the jutsu. Just as planned. The mind transmission jutsu let her dive into the mind of her target, allowing both minds to share the consciousness within the body where the jutsu was activated. They had used this so Shikamaru could share with Ino the plan he had put together. And she would share it with Soku and Ro. It had been the three of them who decided to take this man down, after all. "Okay. Here we go," Shikamaru yelled. Soku and Ro nodded. He raced toward Jingo as Soku and Ro ran to the edges of the room to take up positions in opposite corners. "Whatever you try, it's futile. Look, this is the final battle. We should at least have fun with it." Kunai and Longsword clashed in midair. But there was an overwhelming difference in mass between their weapons of choice, and Shikamaru bent nearly in half, pushed back by Jingo's slash attack. The longsword swiveled around and came back. And again Shikamaru was bifurcated. A shadow, after all. How long will this mockery go on? Jingo spat, frenzied. Dropping from the sky above, Shikamaru attacked the top of his enemy's head, only to be cleared away by the longsword. A shadow again. Shadow, 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 shadow. Over and over, the longsword slashed through Shikamaru. No matter how Jingo slashed and chopped, however, Shikamaru turned into a shadow and vanished into thin air. Where have you gone to, Shikamaru? Another Shikamaru disappeared from Jingo's eyes. Behind you. His enemy didn't notice Shikamaru sneaking up on him. Checkmate. The look on his face changing at the murmured word, Jingo whirled around. Too late. The shadow stretching out from Shikamaru's feet was already entwined with Jingo's body. Producing countless shadow doppelgangers, he had used Ro's power to color them all with rich chakra. Jingo's brain gradually came to remember this as the nature of Shikamaru's doppelganger's chakra. As he cut them down one after another, Jingo had begun to unconsciously chase after the chakra emitted by the doppelgangers. Once he had Jingo chasing this chakra, the real Shikamaru took the rear and used Ro's power once more to erase all of that chakra. When he leapt out from a total blind spot, Jingo had no idea what was happening until he was hit by suffocating darkness. Shikamaru. Body bound, Jingo exhausted every ounce of strength he had to turn his head toward his captor and spit out his name with violent malice. His long tongue, shining slippery and red, peeped out. Hinoko. Shikamaru shouted. Gah! I keep, telling you not to use my name. With an ear-splitting shriek, Soku released chakra from the index finger of her right hand. Shikamaru watched as a bolt of orange lightning precisely caught and pierced Jingo's tongue. Ka! Ka! Thrusting his head up high, Jingo spluttered nothing but dry air. The chakra flowing to your tongue's been cut off. Your body is no longer able to spit out any words. Tears trailed down Jingo's cheeks. I'm definitely going to build a world without war. So forgive me for stealing your dream. As Shikamaru spoke, he sent Ro a signal with his eyes. Indomitable as ever despite the torture and the genjutsu he had been subjected to, the big-boned man ran over, his shoulders rising and falling in an exaggerated gesture. Lock him up and take him to the Alliance. Yes, sir, Lord Shikamaru. Ro nodded, eyes glittering. His gaze was filled with admiration. Trying to hide his embarrassment, Shikamaru pinched the tip of his nose between the tips of his fingers and then pointed at Jingo. As the suffocating darkness jutsu was released, Ro restrained Jingo's arms with handcuffs specially made for the Umbu, with several layers of metal rings and talismans. Before he knew it, Soku was standing behind Ro, mission complete, A little clumsy, but still, at Shikamaru's slight embarrassed grin, their faces crumpled almost into tears, and they nodded. Shikamaru Chapter 4. By the time Shikamaru arrived in the Great Hall with his companions after descending the spiral staircase Jingo in tow, the clash between the revolutionaries and the shinobi was over. The moment Soku had severed the chakra in Jingo's tongue, the genjutsu cast on the revolutionaries had also been released, which had apparently been immensely helpful in ending the fighting. Despite the fierceness of the battle, there were fewer injuries than he would have expected for revolutionaries and ninja alike. Excluding a few critically wounded fighters, everyone had gotten away with scrapes and bruises. It would have been a miracle that no one had died, except this was actually the result of the Sunagakure ninja faithfully carrying out Gaara's order to avoid killing wherever possible. Learning of Jingo's capture, his close aides let their shoulders sag, the will to fight draining from them. It was as though they had woken up from a fever dream and surrendered themselves to a tremendous despair. All over the Great Hall, ninja from Konoha and Sunagakure were restraining demoralized revolutionaries and attending to their wounds. Sigh. Shikamaru spotted his comrade in a group being cared for by ninja. Shikamaru, pulling himself up onto his elbows, Sai stared at Shikamaru with empty eyes. Ino had filled Shikamaru in on the events of the Great Hall after he left as they came down the spiral staircase. Sorry. Sai appeared to still be floating along in a half-trance, perhaps the effect of being yanked out of the genjutsu through rather forceful methods. Don't worry about it. It's all over now, Shikamaru said gently, as he crouched down to touch Sai's shoulder. The supple muscle shuddered slightly, but Sai shed no tears. His heart was crying instead. I'm pathetic. There was magic in his words. I mean, I almost fell into them myself. There's nothing to be ashamed of. But don't worry about it too much. You always take things in stride, never get too worked up about stuff. It's one of your good points. Thanks, Shikamaru. A single tear spilled out of the corner of Sai's wide-open eye. Go back to Konoha and rest a little. I'll talk to Kakashi. Thanks, Sai said, and lowered his head. Ino was standing to one side. Take care of him, Shikamaru told her and stood up. Ino closed her eyes and nodded heavily before crouching down beside Sai as if trading places with Shikamaru. Just as he heaved a sigh of relief, a powerful voice slammed into Shikamaru from behind. Sure. Ka. Ma. Ruu. Right. I totally forgot about this guy. Scratching his head, he turned toward the voice. A fist filled his field of view. His body shuddered. Tumbled. Floor, ceiling, the scene changed at a dizzy pace. 6 turns. Even as this powerful force toyed freely with his body, Shikamaru calmly counted the number of times he spun around. His backside hit the floor, and his body came to an awkward stop. As he sat there, the figure of the person who had swooped down on him leapt into view. He jumped onto Shikamaru like he was riding a horse, while Shikamaru planted his hands on the ground and tried to push himself up. Hands grabbed at his collar and started shaking him violently, jerking his head back and forth and back and forth. "You," the man roared. "Why? Me? Just you. Always. Do this. Everyone. Worried. I mean, me. Gah. You idiot. Sorry, Naruto. You seriously are a giant idiot." Desperately stringing choppy words together, Naruto tried to communicate his feelings. And the feelings he had toward Shikamaru hidden in those indistinct word barks came through loud and clear. The fire that burned deep within Naruto's heart made Shikamaru realize all over again how perfect he was as the leader of Konoha, a village crowned by fire. "You're supposed to be my officer, aren't you?" Apparently, the apology and seeing Shikamaru safe had calmed Naruto down a great deal. "Anyway, this country's all right now," he declared, forcefully. At some point, Sakura had come to stand behind him. "The ruling class here, these revolutionaries, are former ninja, so they all know Naruto, the hero of the last great war. Once they learned he was here, there wasn't a single person willing to go up against him. And then Django was captured, and they woke up from the Jinjutsu, so everything should be contained pretty quickly." The effect of Naruto on the world of ninja was boundless. Just as Sakura said, once they heard Naruto was there, the revolutionaries wouldn't have gone up against him. "Next time something happens, you come straight to me and tell me, got it?" "Yeah." Shikamaru lowered his eyes and nodded obediently. Naruto took his hands off his collar and stood up. "Come on." A strong hand was thrust out. He grabbed it wordlessly. With incredible force, Shikamaru's arm was yanked upward, and he was back on his feet in an instant. Shikamaru envied this direct way of doing things Naruto had, straightforward to the point of being overbearing. And it made him think, if it's for this man. "This is the end," Shikamaru muttered. Naruto cocked his head to one side. He jabbed at Naruto's chest with his fist. "This is the end of you acting like a kid. Yeah. You got some babysitting of your own in your future. Who's this kid we're talking about? You know, don't you?" They smiled quietly at each other. Infinity they decided to first return to Konoha to treat Sai and the two members of the Umbu. Shikamaru left Naruto and Sakura and the others to finish up in the Land of Silence. He could relax with Naruto in charge there. At any rate, as long as Django was now out of the picture, the rest would work itself out. Some of the Sunagakure ninja also stayed, while the rest returned to their village. Once they left Tobari, they would all be traveling separate paths. "I owe you one for this," Shikamaru said to Gaara, standing in front of the large village gates. The sand ninja returning to their village were lined up behind their leader, powerful faces sculpted by the desolation of the desert. All were smiling at Shikamaru. It was one of those tiny, everyday moments that made him feel like the world of the ninja had really started to become one. "No worries. We still need you in the alliance. Don't be so stiff, with all this talk of owing and standing on ceremony. We're friends, and friends would help each other out," Gaara said, arms crossed. The Kazekage hadn't always been such a garrulous man. He had been dangerous, oozing bloodlust, a face like a no mask no one could read any emotion in. And onto this man's lips slipped the same gentle smile as the ninja of Sunagakure. Behind Shikamaru were Sai, Soku, and Ro. And Ino and Choji. The ninja returning to Konoha were also lined up there. They all watched over the exchange with gentle looks. "But I'm so glad," Gaara murmured with feeling. "If my sister hadn't been agonizing over it, we would have lost an important man." Next to Gaara, Temari looked up and off to the side and acted like she hadn't heard anything. She was likely intending to hide her embarrassment, but the move lacked charm. "Don't worry about Django. We'll bring him to Alliance headquarters on our way home. I'm in your debt in more ways than one. And I told you not to stand on formality like that," the Kazekage, who was tremendously popular with the ninja of the village, said, offering his hand. "Well, we'll meet again at the Alliance." Shikamaru also extended his hand. He firmly clasped Gaara's, filled with such warmth it was almost hot. Gaara squeezed back just as firmly. "See you then." Releasing Shikamaru's hand, Gaara turned and looked at his companions. "We're going home. Hoorah!" The ninja of Sunagakure raised their voices like a secret battle cry. Shikamaru called out to Temari as she was turning away, so unconsciously it surprised even him. Temari stopped where she was. The other Sunagakure ninja moved to stop as well, but once they saw that Gaara was signaling them to keep going, they began racing along the main street that stretched out from the gates. Tossing a look in Shikamaru's direction, Gaara followed after them, leading only Temari. "Yee!" Shikamaru heard a high-pitched voice behind him. It was Soku. Ignoring her, Shikamaru approached Temari. "What?" Temari asked, with a sour look. Her eyes were terrifying. After taking a deep breath, as if to bolster his spirits now that he was losing his nerve, Shikamaru tried to say what he was thinking. All this, it was no use. He couldn't say it. "What?" Temari pressed, annoyed. Her body was still turned the slightest bit toward the main road behind her, as if she were trying to chase after her little brother. "Thanks for all this." Temari laughed through her nose, but Shikamaru continued, undaunted. "How about we have dinner or something sometime?" "What? You asking me on a date?" Temari asked, tone casual but eyes deadly serious. She didn't have a molecule of shame, she was completely unendearing. "Why am I asking a woman like this to dinner?" Shikamaru asked himself. "Yeah, I guess that's the gist of it," he said, without thinking. But he had asked, and that was that. Or rather, he had called out to stop her because he wanted to ask her. Feelings he himself didn't understand threw Shikamaru into confusion. A date, huh? Almost as if she were sitting on war council before a problematic enemy, Temari put a hand on her chin and gave the matter serious consideration. "You don't want to?" he asked, abruptly. She stared fixedly at his face for a while before taking her hand off her chin and placing it on her hip. "What a drog," she said. The full smile she turned on him then was something very precious to Shikamaru. Epilogue. It had been a week since they left the Land of Silence. At Kakashi's discretion, with the idea that he should recover from his confinement in Fushu Castle and his exhaustion after the battle with Django, Shikamaru had been ordered to take a break. But Sakura had healed the wound on his forehead soon after the battle, and he didn't actually have any bodily injuries that would require him to take time off. And his heart was actually lighter than it had been before he went to the Land of Silence. He had no particular need for time off, but Kakashi had told him to rest in no uncertain terms, and so he was resting, given that he had no other choice. Choji and Ino and the others had gone on another mission not long after their return to Konoha, and Naruto and Sakura were still in the Land of Silence. He did go over to Master Kurenai's house to visit Mirai, but a few hours' conversation was more than sufficient. Which meant he had all this time alone with nothing to actually do. A whole week with no one disturbing him. For the first time in a long time, his days were quiet. Sometimes, he spent the entire day staring at a shogi board and moving the pieces by himself. Other times, he left the village and went mountain climbing or stared up at the clouds endlessly from the moment the sun climbed up into the sky until the sky was dyed with dusk. He enjoyed every minute of it almost more than he could stand. He keenly felt the change in himself. The Shikamaru from before the Land of Silence would certainly have panicked at being away from missions and his work with the Alliance for a whole week. He would have been thinking about all sorts of ridiculous things, like whether or not some big thing was happening while he was away, or what if someone made some critical mistake. He wouldn't have been able to have even a single satisfying day off. But now, he had relaxed almost too much. This week, about the only time he remembered missions or the Alliance was during the 10 minutes in his futon before he fell asleep. Even if he wasn't there, his comrades would get the job done for him. He had naturally started thinking like this. It wasn't as though his sense of responsibility had disappeared. It was just that he had created some wiggle room for himself. If there was a situation where he was actually needed, Kakashi or Temari would call him. And he could switch gears in that moment and still handle any situation more than capably. There was no need to spend his time off thinking about rushing headlong into work. Precisely because he trusted his comrades, he was able to switch gears so completely. But he had been driving himself so hard that he had stopped understanding this very simple fact. Over his week-long vacation, he could objectively observe, to the point of unpleasantness, just how himself before the land of silence and himself after were different. He came to see how important his comrades were, along with his own small-mindedness and arrogant, mistaken pride in trying to shoulder the burden of anything and everything all by himself. A person couldn't live alone. He wasn't so almighty he could master everything all by himself. Which was why he had friends. The very idea of trying to take on the burden alone had been a mistake. And if only to learn this lesson, his trip to the land of silence had been a worthwhile one. When he had very nearly been swayed by Django at Fushu Castle, a single hit from Temari had blown everything away. He had seen in that storm the clear answer to the question of who he was. Basically, Shikamaru was an irresponsible man. Everything was a hassle, and the truth was, he didn't want to do any of it. If he could have just spaced out, he would have gladly stepped back and bowed out for several days. That was the real Shikamaru. And that was all right. Because he acknowledged this irresponsible, happy-go-lucky self, there were things he could do. Only someone like him could understand the feelings of those who long for ordinary lives without dreams. What was wrong with being happy with just right? Dreams weren't all about aiming for the sky, for some lofty goal or objective. In a world where war continued, this dream was maybe a difficult one. And that's why there was meaning in his being there. If this world were at peace, if it became a world where everyone could live a quiet life, then those people wishing for a just right life would get that just right life. Unfortunately, Shikamaru had been born into a world of war. And so he lived this busy life. For the sake of the people who would be born in the future, he had to end these wars. This dream didn't spring from any lofty ideals like Django's. Nor was it anything as noble as ambition or will. A world in which everyone could live lazy lives. For someone trying to build such a world, it was a bit like putting the cart before the horse to work frantically to make it happen. Do work that was just right. That was enough. Infinity seriously. Thanks for all your hard work on this one, Kakashi said, as he tapped a sheaf of paper against his desk. Shikamaru had reported to the Hokage's office to be debriefed on the Land of Silence incident. I got the overall picture from the current reports from Sakura, who's still on the ground there, and from the mission completion reports from Ino and the others. I also heard about your hard work from Soku and Ro, who are getting medical treatment. My hard work? The ends of his eyebrows naturally twitched up into an embarrassed expression. Unable to see through Django's genjutsu, he had been caught up in it, and only when Temari came along and saved him had he been able to wake up. He had been rescued by his comrades, right up until the end. He hadn't accomplished a single thing by himself. Although you really didn't have to write such a detailed report during your holiday, Kakashi's eyes dropped to the mountain of papers in his hand, a bundle of nearly 50 pages. The papers he had been needing out before were the report Shikamaru had written. In the end, it had been the present tense missions and alliance he hadn't thought about during his break. The incident in the Land of Silence was different. Summarizing everything into a report was one of the duties of a shinobi, and it was only natural that he would do this much during his break. That said, it had been light work, only about an hour a day. I'll look it over, With a sigh, Kakashi placed the report on top of the mountain of papers on the edge of his desk. And the mountain stretched closer to the sky. Without a glance at the unsteady pile of paper, Kakashi turned his gaze on Shikamaru. You're someone we really need both here and in the Alliance. You need to take better care of yourself, okay? Someone we really need. What a drag. The words spilled from his lips automatically. You're alright now, huh? Kakashi laughed, staring fixedly at Shikamaru's face. Yeah. Shikamaru laughed too. Okay then. The Hokage placed his hand on the back of his neck and shook his head several times before slipping his other hand into a desk drawer. He pulled out a document of some kind and offered it to Shikamaru. Shikamaru took it and dropped his eyes onto the page. It laid out the details of a mission stamped with a red B-rank mark: follow and act as guard to a retainer of the daimyo of the Land of Fire to deliver a sovereign message to the Land of Lightning. Thanks to the impact of the new connections between ninja forged by the Alliance, public safety was greatly improved, and traveling back and forth between two countries was markedly easier than it had been in the past. The daimyo's attendants alone were basically sufficient, but several ninja were attached to the party in case of anything unexpected. It was a case that could be satisfactorily handled by any ninja at the Chunin level or higher and didn't especially require Shikamaru. It's a mission that's too easy for you, but, Kakashi, can I say something? Shikamaru said, cutting the Hokage off with his right hand. Kakashi stared at him with a surprised look. It's been a while since you called me Kakashi. You kind of threw me there. I decided to quit twisting myself up into some ideal, worrying about form and appearance all the time. Glad to hear it. Kakashi nodded, and Shikamaru returned to the issue at hand. About this mission, could you give it to someone else? Why? Oh, it's just that the day after tomorrow, averting his eyes, Shikamaru's cheeks took on a red hue. Cocking his head to one side, Kakashi waited for Shikamaru to continue. I have a date. PFT. Kakashi erupted, and Shikamaru glared. I'm just surprised. I never thought you'd refuse a mission for a date. But that's great. You go and enjoy. Thank you. That thing called youth, huh? Kakashi closed his eyes and crossed his arms, nodded several times. He'd given up on a just right life. So he deserved this much at least. Well, I'll excuse myself then. He turned his back to Kakashi and set his right foot forward, moving to leave the room. Shikamaru. When he turned around again, Kakashi was standing up. I figured maybe the curry you might understand a bit better. Can I ask you one more time? What does it mean to be an adult? Turning his eyes up to the ceiling, Shikamaru thought about it for a while. And then he let the words that popped into his head come out as is. Honest. Giving up on something and finding something more important. Maybe something like that. Although I'm not totally sure. Giving up on something and finding something more important, Some guys are like Naruto, they're totally focused on one thing from the time they're kids. But most guys are lost and they give up on a thing, but they still keep on walking, and then finally, they find something important, and maybe they live toward that. Makes sense. Kakashi crossed his arms and lowered his eyes. Okay then. I'll be on my way, Shikamaru said, turning around, too embarrassed to stay there any longer. Go and have fun, Shikamaru. The instant he closed the door, he heard Kakashi's bright voice. Thank you, Shikamaru said, words that wouldn't reach the Hokage. Infinity get everyone on board and the time flows gently. Does he look like me? The baby was crying languidly, as though he had seen through everything in this world, even though he had only just been born into it. It's okay. There'll be a time when you realize you don't know anything. You'll make friends who'll head toward that moment with you. The baby, who of course couldn't understand anything I said, stared at me, opening wide, single-lidded almond eyes, his mother's eyes. Guess I can't say what a drag or anything anymore. You can a bit. Just don't get crazy with it. And before you really stop moving, I'll yank on your cheek again and send you flying. Oh, yeah, right. What should we call him? What a drag. End of Shikamaru Hiden, a cloud drifting in the silent dark. Thank you for listening. Remember to like and subscribe for lots more.